The alarm klaxons screamed through the corridors of Station Omega-7, their piercing wails echoing off metallic walls like the death cries of some mechanical beast. Commander Jake Morrison pressed his back against the reinforced blast door, feeling the vibrations of enemy plasma fire reverberating through the thick steel. Behind him, the evacuation pods were launching in rapid succession, each one carrying precious civilian refugees to safety among the stars. "Commander, we need to go now." Lieutenant Kira shouted over the chaos, her voice barely audible above the explosions rocking the station. "The last transport leaves in 30 seconds. Jake shook his head, his weathered face set with grim determination. "Someone has to hold them back. Get to the ship, Lieutenant." "That's an order." Through the station's massive observation windows, the sight was both beautiful and terrifying. The Voidborn fleet stretched across the darkness like a constellation of malevolent stars, their bioships pulsing with sickly green light. Each vessel was the size of a small moon, their organic hulls writhing with tentacles that could crush. A battleship like an empty can. For 3 cycles, they had swept across the galaxy, consuming entire star systems and leaving nothing but cosmic dust in their wake. Kira's face contorted with anguish. She had served under Jake for 5 years, had seen him pull miracles from impossible situations, but this was different. This was suicide. "Sir, you can't hold off an entire invasion force alone." "Watch me," Jake replied, checking his rifle's power cell one final time. He thought of his daughter Emma back on Earth, probably just finishing her morning classes at the academy. He thought of the millions of souls depending on this evacuation, the children who deserved to see another sunrise. The blast door groaned under increasing pressure. Cracks began to spider across its surface as the Voidborn's acid weapons ate through the reinforced plating. Jake could hear their chittering voices beyond the barrier, a sound like breaking glass mixed with dying screams. Every great bond starts with a single moment of courage. HFY Chronicle Stories is just beginning, and your support matters. If you love emotional sci-fi tales, forbidden connections, and stories that stay with you, hit subscribe. It's free, and it helps us bring more stories from the stars to you. "Sir," Kira's voice broke slightly, "if you're really doing this, let me stay with you." Jake turned to face her, his eyes softening for just a moment. "Your duty is to those people on the transports, not to an old soldier who's lived long enough. Besides," he managed a crooked smile, "someone needs to tell them how this ends." The door exploded inward with a thunderous crash, revealing the nightmare beyond. Voidborn soldiers poured through the breach like a tide of living shadow, their exoskeletons gleaming whitely in the emergency lighting. Each creature stood twice the height of a human, with elongated limbs that ended in razor-sharp claws. Their faces were featureless except for rows of needle-like teeth that dripped with caustic saliva. Jake opened fire, his plasma rifle cutting bright lines through the darkness. "Go, now!" Kira hesitated for one agonizing heartbeat, then turned and sprinted toward the docking bay. Behind her, she could hear Jake's weapon firing in controlled bursts, each shot precise and deadly. The human wasn't just fighting for time, he was fighting like he actually believed he could win. As the transport ship pulled away from the station, Kira pressed her face against the porthole and watched in amazement. Through the chaos of battle, she could see muzzle flashes from Jake's position, still holding steady against the overwhelming odds. The impossible human was actually doing it. 3 hours into the siege, something unprecedented began to happen aboard Station Omega-7. The Voidborn advance, which had been relentless and systematic across dozens of worlds, had ground to a complete halt. Every attempt to push past the central corridor met with devastating resistance from a single human defender, who seemed to possess an almost supernatural understanding of warfare. Jake had transformed the station into a maze of death. Using his intimate knowledge of the facility's layout, he had rigged impromptu explosives from maintenance supplies turning routine ventilation shafts into kill zones. When the Voidborn tried to flank through the lower levels, they found gravity. Wells reversed, sending their assault teams tumbling into hastily constructed spike traps. Every corridor had become a carefully orchestrated ambush. High Admiral Vex, commander of the Voidborn assault fleet, watched the tactical displays with growing frustration. In 3 cycles of conquest, no single world had held out for more than 6 hours. Yet here, one small space station defended by a lone human had repelled 17 separate assault waves. How many defenders remain on the station? Vex inquired, his 4 arms manipulating the holographic controls with fluid precision. Our scans detect only 1 life sign, Admiral, replied his tactical officer. A single human male, approximately 45 standard years old. Vex's mandibles clicked in disbelief. 1? You're certain? Confirmed, sir. 1 human is holding an entire space station against our forces. The Admiral studied the human's tactics with grudging respect. This wasn't the desperate last stand of a cornered animal. This was artistry. The human had turned the station itself into a weapon, using every system, every structural element as part of an elaborate defensive network. Blast doors sealed and unsealed in perfect timing to channel Voidborn forces into prepared kill zones. Life support systems had been weaponized, flooding certain sections with knockout gas, while maintaining breathable atmosphere in others out back on the station. Jake moved through the maintenance tunnels like a ghost. His uniform was torn and bloodied, his face blackened with soot and debris, but his eyes burned with unwavering determination. He had studied Voidborn tactics during their advance across the galaxy, noting their reliance on overwhelming force and their weakness when faced with unpredictable resistance. Computer, status report, he whispered into his communicator. 17 assault waves repelled. The station's AI responded in its calm mechanical voice. Enemy casualties estimated at 436. Station integrity at 67%. Jake smiled grimly. He had been counting on their predictability. The Voidborn were excellent at crushing organized resistance, but they had no experience with guerrilla warfare. They expected formations, battle lines, conventional tactics. Instead, they found shadows and smoke, explosions from impossible angles, and a defender who seemed to be everywhere at once. The human crawled through another access tunnel, emerging behind a group of Voidborn soldiers who were attempting to breach the command center. His plasma rifle whispered death, dropping 3 of the creatures before they even knew he was there. By the time they turned to return fire, Jake had already vanished back into the labyrinthine depths of the station. Admiral Vex's patience was wearing thin. Deploy the heavy assault units. I want that human terminated. Sir, the station's narrow corridors limit the effectiveness of our larger units. Perhaps we should deploy them. Vex snarled. I will not be humiliated by a single primitive. But as the massive biomechs lumbered through the station's passages, they found themselves trapped in spaces too small for their bulk. Jake had anticipated this as well, collapsing key structural supports to create choke points that turned the Voidborn's greatest weapons into liabilities. The heavy units became stuck, blocking their own reinforcements while Jake picked them apart with precise shots to their vulnerable power cores. By the 6th hour, something extraordinary was happening throughout the galaxy. Word of the humans' impossible stand was spreading through quantum communication networks, reaching refugee fleets and resistance cells scattered across hundreds of star systems. For the first time since the Voidborn invasion began, hope was kindling in hearts that had known only despair. News of Jake Morrison's stand reached the Galactic Council chambers on Terra Nova, just as the emergency session was convening to discuss evacuation protocols for the remaining inhabited systems. The Great Amphitheater, which normally hosted diplomatic discussions about trade routes and territorial disputes, had become a war room filled with desperate military commanders from a dozen species. Ladies and gentlemen, announced Council Speaker. Dex, his scaled features grave with exhaustion. We have received confirmation that Station Omega-7 continues to resist Voidborn occupation. The defender is ... He paused, checking his notes again as if unable to believe them. A single human. Male. The chamber erupted in voices. The tall, ethereal luminary delegates whispered among themselves in their melodic tongue, while the rock-skinned Taraxi pounded their stone fists in what could have been either approval or disbelief. General Tam of the Aquatic Syndicate's forces leaned forward in his environmental suit, tentacles writhing with agitation. "Impossible," declared Admiral Rex of the Phoenix Coalition Fleet. "My ships barely escaped that sector with 30%. Casualties. No single individual could withstand a concentrated Voidborn assault, but the reports kept coming. Every hour brought new tactical updates that defied military logic. Jake Morrison wasn't just surviving, he was winning. Somehow, the human had turned a routine space station into an impregnable fortress, and the Voidborn advance had stalled for the first time in their 3-year campaign of conquest. Dr. Elena Vasquez, Earth's chief xenobiologist, stood to address the assembly. "If I may, honored colleagues, humans possess certain evolutionary traits that might explain this phenomenon. Our species developed under constant predation pressure, creating what we call adaptive persistence. When cornered, humans don't just fight, they innovate." On Station Omega-7, Jake was demonstrating exactly that principle. He had discovered that Voidborn bioarmor, while resistant to energy weapons, had a fatal weakness to rapid temperature changes. Using the station's environmental controls, he had created thermal shock traps that caused their exoskeletons to crack and shatter. The Voidborn had tried everything: direct assault, flanking maneuvers, even attempting to cut off the stations. Power grid. Jake countered each strategy with increasingly creative solutions. When they cut main power, he had rigged emergency batteries to power defensive systems. When they tried to flood the station with toxic gas, he activated fire suppression systems to create safe breathing zones. When they attempted to breach the he used the decompression to suck entire assault teams into space. Admiral Vex was beginning to understand why the Voidborn had avoided human space during their initial expansion. Reports from their scouts had described humans as unpredictable and resource inefficient, leading the swarm to focus on more populous systems. Now Vex was learning that what the scouts had interpreted as weakness was actually humanity's greatest strength. "Admiral," his communications officer reported, "we're receiving inquiries from the other fleets. They want to know why we haven't secured the station." Vex's 4 eyes fixed on the tactical display, where the single human life sign continued to move through the station with methodical purpose. "Tell them we're dealing with a new form of resistance. Request additional forces." But even as reinforcements arrived, Jake continued to adapt. He had learned to read Voidborn attack patterns, anticipating their moves like a chess master thinking 10 steps ahead. When Wave 23 approached through the cargo bay, they found it flooded with liquid nitrogen. Wave 24 encountered a maze of severed power cables that electrocuted anything that touched them. The human had transformed warfare from a clash of armies into a deadly game of wits, and he was winning. Meanwhile, across the galaxy, something remarkable was happening. Resistance cells that had been in hiding for months suddenly began emerging from their shelters. The symbol of Jake Morrison, a single star burning bright against the darkness, appeared on blast walls and communication networks. Refugee ships changed course, heading toward human space instead of fleeing toward the galactic rim. Commander Lisa Park of the defense station at Kepler Station received a transmission from her crew. "Ma'am, if one human can hold off the entire Voidborn fleet, maybe we don't need to run." The legend was already beginning to grow, spreading faster than the Voidborn could advance. Across 1,000 worlds, beings who had given up hope were remembering what it meant to fight back. 12 hours into the siege, the impossible had become undeniable. Jake Morrison had not only held Station Omega-7 against overwhelming odds, he had begun pushing back. The Void-born, masters of biological warfare who had consumed entire star systems, found themselves retreating from corridors they had already captured. The human had learned to think like his enemy, to anticipate their movements and exploit their biological imperative to swarm. Where they expected overwhelming force to carry the day, they found carefully planned chaos. Jake had rewired the station systems to create feedback loops that turned their own biotechnology against them. Status. Report, Admiral Vex demanded, his forearms twitching with frustration. We've lost 643 units, his tactical officer replied, mandibles clicking nervously. The human has retaken sections 4 through 7 and established defensive positions that are ... impregnable. Vex studied the holographic display showing the station's layout. Somehow, the single human defender had created interlocking fields of fire that made advance impossible without catastrophic losses. Worse, he seemed to be learning their tactics faster than they could adapt to his. Jake crouched in the station's central hub, surrounded by jury-rigged equipment that would have made a military engineer weep with either admiration or horror. He had connected the environmental controls to the weapon systems, linked the artificial gravity to the communications array, and somehow managed to turn the entire station into a single massive defensive network. Computer, analysis of enemy. Movement patterns, he requested, wiping blood from a gash on his forehead. Void-born forces follow predictable attack algorithms, the AI responded. They concentrate forces at perceived weak points, retreat when casualties exceed 12% of assault strength, and regroup using standard bioswarm protocols. Jake nodded. The Void-born were incredibly effective against conventional military forces, but they were still following programmed responses. Their biological imperatives made them powerful but also predictable. By contrast, human unpredictability, what military theorists called tactical chaos, was proving to be their perfect counter. News of the continuing battle had reached Earth itself, where President Martinez addressed a world holding its breath. Citizens of Earth, her voice carried across every communication channel, one of our own stands alone against the darkness. Commander Jake Morrison has shown the galaxy what humanity means when we say, no further. The speech was translated into 300 languages and broadcast across known space. On mining colonies and trading outposts, in refugee camps and military bases, beings who had never heard of humans before were learning their name through one man's impossible stand. Back on Station Omega-7, Jake had discovered something that would change the course of the war. The Void-born weren't just following biological imperatives, they were operating under technological limitations. Their bioships, for all their terrifying power, required constant coordination from command nodes. Disrupt the command structure, and the swarm became just another mob. Computer, can you trace their command signals? Affirmative. Central command node located on bioship designated Alpha Prime. Coordinates uploading to your display. Jake studied the tactical information, his mind racing through possibilities. The command ship was heavily defended, surrounded by escort vessels and protected by energy shields that could deflect planetary bombardment. But it had one weakness: it needed to maintain close proximity to coordinate the assault. Working with tools that were never meant for combat, Jake began constructing something that military historians would later call the most audacious weapon: improvisation in galactic history. Using the station's primary communications array, several fusion power cells, and components cannibalized from maintenance drones, he built what was essentially a directed electromagnetic pulse device. "This is insane," he muttered to himself, connecting the final power coupling. But then again, so is holding off an alien invasion with a glorified radio antenna. The device wouldn't destroy the command ship, but it might disrupt their biological control networks long enough to create chaos in their ranks. Jake had noticed that when Voidborn units lost contact with their command node, they became confused, aggressive toward each other, sometimes even turning on their own forces. Admiral Vex watched in growing alarm as his bioship's sensors detected massive energy buildup within the station. "What is that human doing now?" "Unknown, Admiral. Energy readings are off our scales." Through the observation windows, Jake could see the massive bioships floating in formation, their organic hulls pulsing with bioluminescent patterns that served as their communication network. He had one chance to make this work. If he failed, the station would be overwhelmed within minutes. "For Emma," he whispered, thinking of his daughter's smile. "For everyone who deserves to see tomorrow." Jake activated the device. The electromagnetic pulse erupted from Station Omega-7 like a synthetic nova, washing over the Voidborn fleet in waves of disrupted energy. Across dozens of bioships, command nodes flickered and failed, leaving thousands of Voidborn soldiers suddenly cut off from their collective consciousness. For the first time in 3 years of conquest, the Voidborn advance didn't just stop, it collapsed into chaos. The aftermath of Jake Morrison's electromagnetic pulse attack created a phenomenon that xenobiologists would study for generations. Across the Voidborn fleet, ships began turning on each other as individual bio-units, cut off from their collective consciousness, reverted to primitive territorial instincts. The perfect coordination that had made them unstoppable became their greatest weakness when that coordination was severed. Admiral Vex watched in horror as his own escort ships began firing on each other, their bio-cannons tearing through hulls that moments before had been allied vessels. "Restore command link immediately," he ordered, but his technical officers could only shake their heads. The human's device had created cascading failures throughout their entire bio-network. On Station Omega-7, Jake slumped against his improvised command center, exhaustion finally catching up with him. Through the observation windows, he could see the chaos spreading through the enemy fleet like wildfire. Bioships were breaking formation, some fleeing toward deep space, while others attacked anything within range. "Computer, status of evacuation. Transports. All civilian vessels have reached minimum safe distance," the AI reported. "Galactic Council forces are requesting permission to engage the disorganized enemy fleet." Jake allowed himself a grim smile. He had done it. Not only had he held the line long enough for the evacuation to succeed, but he had given the galaxy its first real victory against the Voidborn invasion. The psychological impact would be immense. If one human could accomplish this, what could organized resistance achieve? The communication system crackled to life. "Station Omega-7, this is Admiral Rex of the Phoenix Coalition. Commander Morrison, your actions have given us the opening we needed. Requesting tactical assessment of enemy fleet status." Jake looked at the chaos outside and began transmitting everything he had learned about Voidborn weaknesses, tactics, and command structures. Information that had cost him 12 hours of impossible combat was now spreading to every military force in the galaxy. "Admiral, their biological machines following programmed responses. Disrupt their command network, and they turn on each other. Target the bioships with the most bioluminescent activity, those are their command nodes." As the Phoenix Coalition fleet engaged the confused Voidborn forces, something extraordinary happened. The mysterious invaders who had seemed unstoppable began falling back, their coordination shattered and their advantage lost. For the first time since the invasion began, Galactic Council forces were winning. News of the victory reached Earth within hours, but by then Jake Morrison's name was already legendary across the galaxy. The story of the human who held the line had grown in the telling, spreading through quantum communication networks faster than light itself. On refugee stations, parents told their children about the guardian who fought off monsters in the dark. In military academies, His tactics were being analyzed and incorporated into new training protocols. Dr. Alina Vasquez addressed the Galactic Council's emergency session with tears in her eyes. Honored colleagues, what we witnessed today was more than military strategy. Commander Morrison demonstrated what humans call indomitable spirit, the refusal to surrender regardless of odds. This isn't just courage. It's a fundamental rejection of defeat that seems to be uniquely human. The tall Luminari delegate Ava spoke in her melodic voice. We have studied human psychology extensively, but we never understood this trait you call stubborn hope. Today we learned why the Voidborn avoided your space. They instinctively recognized a threat they couldn't comprehend. General Tam of the Aquatic Syndicate added his perspective. In our military doctrine, retreat is tactical wisdom when facing superior force, but humans ... Humans fight harder when the odds are worst. This defies all logical tactical thought, yet it achieved what our combined fleets could not. Back on Station Omega-7, rescue ships were finally approaching. Jake Morrison sat quietly in his improvised command center, watching the Voidborn fleet limping toward deep space in complete disarray. He thought about the messages flooding in from across the galaxy, gratitude from refugees he'd never meet, respect from military commanders who'd studied warfare for centuries, hope from beings who'd forgotten what victory looked like. Lieutenant Kira was among the first to reach him, her face showing a mixture of relief, admiration, and something approaching awe. Sir, the entire galaxy is talking about what you did here. They're calling you the Guardian of the Stars, the Lone Wolf of Omega-7. How does it feel to be a living legend? Jake looked up at her, his weathered face showing the exhaustion of 12 hours of impossible combat. But his eyes held something else, a quiet satisfaction that came from duty fulfilled and promises kept. Kira, I was just a soldier doing his job. The real heroes are those civilian transports full of families heading home to safety. I just made sure they had time to get there. But even as he spoke those humble words, Jake Morrison knew that something fundamental had changed in the galaxy. The Voidborn were no longer invincible. The legend of one human holding the line would inspire resistance movements across 1,000 worlds. Hope, once lost, had been rekindled by simple human refusal to surrender. The evacuation was over, but the legend had just begun.